Alice Grayson had spent years working her way up in the world of cybersecurity, a field that demanded sharp instincts, an unyielding attention to detail, and an understanding that true threats rarely came in the form of obvious, brute force attacks. They were subtle, creeping into systems unnoticed, exploiting overlooked vulnerabilities, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was that same mindset that made her approach life with careful precision. She wasn't the type to make reckless decisions, nor was she prone to paranoia. She simply believed in being prepared, in understanding the landscape before taking action, in recognizing when a situation was more than what it initially seemed. So when she first noticed the wrought iron gates blocking the shared driveway to her house, she didn't react with immediate outrage or confusion. Instead, she sat in her car for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, studying the structure in front of her with the same analytical patience she applied to her work. The gates were new, expertly installed, with a sleek keypad attached to a sturdy metal post. The design wasn't an afterthought, it was deliberate, integrated seamlessly with the aesthetic of the surrounding homes, as though it had always been there, as though the entire neighborhood had agreed upon its necessity. But Alice knew better. This wasn't here yesterday. She turned off the engine and stepped out, the cool morning air biting at her skin as she approached the gate, running her fingers lightly over the keypad. No obvious brand markings, no company insignia. Just a digital lock requiring a code that she did not have. Her gaze flickered to the side, landing on a small polished plaque bolted onto the post. Private property access restricted. Users must register. Monthly fee $500. Her first reaction was neither panic nor frustration, but a slow, dawning realization that this was a calculated move, one that had not been made hastily or impulsively. She knew exactly who was responsible before she even turned her head toward the house across the driveway. Douglas Wade had always been a man who understood leverage. He wasn't physically imposing, nor did he raise his voice or make threats outright. His power came from knowing the system better than the people around him, from finding legal gray areas and exploiting them with the same efficiency that Alice used to patch security vulnerabilities. Wade was in his late 50s, a retired entrepreneur who had made his fortune in real estate investment and development, though that wasn't the version of himself he advertised to the neighbors. To them, he was simply Douglas, the concerned resident, who always seemed to have a hand in local affairs, who spoke in measured tones about the importance of property values and community standards, who smiled just enough to appear friendly but never quite enough to be trusted. Alice had moved into her house 3 years ago and had never had a direct conflict with him, but she had watched the way he operated. He had a way of getting what he wanted without ever seeming like he was forcing the issue. A fence suddenly appeared between properties without warning, and if anyone objected, there would be paperwork proving it had always been planned. Streetlights were installed at his own expense, but suddenly the cost of maintenance was being shared among the neighbors. Minor inconveniences were introduced gradually, just enough to make resistance seem like an overreaction, and now this. Alice wasn't the type to react impulsively, but she wasn't passive either. She took a slow breath, composing herself, then crossed the short distance to Wade's front door. She rang the doorbell, hearing the chime echo from within, and waited. There was no immediate answer, but she knew better than to leave. Wade was watching. She could feel it. After a long moment, the door opened a fraction, revealing his composed, almost amused expression. He was dressed in his usual manner, casual, but calculated, a pressed button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled just enough to appear effortless. He leaned against the doorframe, tilting his head slightly, as if she were an expected guest arriving precisely on time. Alice, he greeted smoothly, his voice carrying that same practiced neutrality. "What can I do for you?" She gestured toward the gate without turning her head. "What the hell is this?" Wade smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. An improvement, she repeated flatly. "On what, exactly?" "The security of our shared space," he spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had already rehearsed his responses, as if he had anticipated this conversation long before she even stepped out of her car. "This road has always been a concern. Open access creates unnecessary risks. Property crime is on the rise. I'm sure you understand the value of precaution, given your field of expertise. Alice's fingers curled slightly. You can drop the sales pitch. You didn't install this for security. You installed it for control. His smile didn't falter, but there was the slightest narrowing of his gaze. That's an awfully cynical assumption. It's an accurate one. She folded her arms, forcing herself to remain calm. Let's cut through the bullshit. You didn't get approval for this, because if you had, I would have been notified. This isn't legal. Wade sighed as if she were being unreasonable, shaking his head with carefully measured disappointment. I assure you, everything is perfectly above board. He stepped back, disappearing for a brief moment before returning with a folder, holding it out for her to take. If you'd like to review the paperwork, I have all the necessary documentation right here. Alice didn't take it. Instead, she stared at him for a long, assessing moment, then glanced at the folder. She didn't need to see what was inside to know what it would contain. Carefully curated, legally ambiguous, just enough to slow her down, to make her second guess, to make it clear that fighting him would be a process. That was his game. Not outright denial, not obvious intimidation, just enough friction to exhaust anyone who stood in his way. She exhaled slowly. You're making a mistake, Wade. His expression didn't change, but there was something behind his eyes now, something sharp and knowing. Then I suppose we'll see how this plays out. Alice turned without another word, walking back toward her car, feeling the weight of his gaze on her as she moved. She didn't allow herself to react, didn't allow herself to show frustration or hesitation. But as she reached for the door handle, her eyes flickered toward the keypad once more, and for the first time, a different kind of recognition settled in. The system was too sophisticated for a simple gate. The installation was too precise, the timing too convenient. This wasn't just about blocking access. This was about something more. Alice had spent her career studying patterns, recognizing anomalies, identifying breaches before they turned into disasters. And something about this felt wrong. Alice didn't waste time after walking away from Wade's front door. She wasn't someone who made threats she couldn't follow through on, nor was she the type to sit back and hope the situation would resolve itself. As she drove past the newly installed gate and parked in her driveway, her mind was already running through every possible angle of attack. Wade wanted her to react emotionally, to lash out, to make this a simple dispute between neighbors so he could frame himself as the rational party. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Instead of storming back outside, she went inside, locked her door, and methodically pulled out every document related to her property. The original sale records, the legal description of the land, the agreements regarding shared access, anything that could tell her exactly where she stood. She wasn't a lawyer, but she knew how to read between the lines, how to identify inconsistencies, how to spot when something didn't add up. And something about this entire situation felt deliberately murky. An hour into her search, she found what she was looking for. The original deed specified that the driveway was shared access, designated as a private road but legally bound to remain open to both properties. There was no clause allowing unilateral modifications, no stipulation that ownership could be transferred to a third party without agreement from all involved parties. That meant Wade had either found some loophole or more likely created one. She pulled out her laptop and started digging deeper. First, she checked the county records for recent transactions. It didn't take long to find it 3 days ago. Wade had filed a claim reclassifying the driveway under the name of a limited liability corporation, Wade Infrastructure, LLC. That in itself was suspicious. An LLC for a single shared driveway? The move was so blatant it almost felt like a dare. Alice's fingers drummed against the desk as she considered her options. The obvious choice was to call a lawyer immediately, but she knew how these things worked. Legal battles took time, and Wade had made his move knowing that any challenge would be a slow, uphill process. She needed to get ahead of him before he had time to entrench himself further. She opened a new tab and searched the name of Wade's LLC, sifting through business records, financial filings, anything that might tell her more. Most of it was boilerplate, registered under a generic business address, with Wade listed as the sole managing member. But buried in the filings was something else, a transaction linking the LLC to a private equity firm specializing in property acquisitions. That was the real play. Wade wasn't just blocking access, he was setting the stage for something bigger. Her stomach tightened as she considered the implications. If Wade had control of the driveway, he could start controlling who accessed their properties. He could make living there so inconvenient that selling would seem like the only reasonable option. And if she or any of the neighbors decided to sell, he would be first in line to buy, likely through some other front company, acquiring properties at a fraction of their value. It was textbook real estate manipulation: create an artificial inconvenience, drive out resistance, then capitalize on the fallout. A cold wave of anger settled in her chest. This wasn't about security. This wasn't even about Wade's personal ego. This was calculated, deliberate, and Alice had no intention of sitting back while he carved up the neighborhood for profit. She picked up her phone and dialed the county assessor's office. After a few rings, a woman answered, her tone polite but distant. "County assessor's office, how can I help you?" Alice kept her voice measured. "I need to confirm a recent property transaction, specifically a reclassification of a shared driveway under a newly formed LLC. Do you have the parcel number?" She pulled up the filing and read it off, listening as the woman on the other end typed. There was a short pause before she responded. "It looks like the change was processed 3 days ago. Everything appears to be in order." Alice leaned forward. "Can you tell me if any objections were filed before approval?" Another pause. No objections recorded. That wasn't surprising. Wade had likely moved quickly, filed everything under the radar, and counted on the fact that no one would notice until it was too late. Alice forced herself to remain calm. "Is there any way to challenge the transfer?" "You'd have to file a dispute, but you'd need to demonstrate that the change was made in error or through misrepresentation." Misrepresentation. That was the key. If Wade had misrepresented the status of the driveway in his filing, then Alice had an opening. But she needed more than just a hunch. She needed something concrete, something that proved he hadn't followed the proper legal channels. She thanked the woman and hung up, her mind racing. She needed legal help, but more than that, she needed leverage. Wade had power because he controlled the narrative, but if she could find something that made his position untenable, something that forced him into a corner before he had time to solidify his grip, she could flip the situation in her favor. Just as she was considering her next move, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Hello." There was silence on the other end for a moment, then a voice, smooth and detached. "You're wasting your time." Alice felt her grip tighten on the phone. "Who is this?" You already know the voice wasn't Wade's, but the implication was clear. "It doesn't matter what you think you found. You won't win this." She felt a sharp spike of adrenaline. "You should work on your intimidation tactics," she said coldly, "because this is just making me more interested in what you're trying to hide." There was a slight chuckle, then a click as the line went dead. Alice lowered the phone, staring at the screen for a moment before exhaling slowly. If Wade was already trying to rattle her, that meant she was closer to the truth than he wanted her to be, and that meant she had his attention now. She didn't know exactly what game he was playing yet, but she knew one thing for certain: he had underestimated her. That was his first mistake, and it wouldn't be his last. Alice knew better than to ignore a warning call, especially one as deliberate as the one she had just received. Whoever had called her wasn't trying to scare her away with mindless threats. They were telling her, in no uncertain terms, that she was stepping into something deeper than a petty property dispute. And that meant two things. First, Wade wasn't working alone, and second, whatever they were trying to accomplish wasn't just about a driveway. She set her phone down and took a slow breath, forcing herself to think strategically. It was tempting to act immediately, to drive back to Wade's house and demand answers, to push harder and see how much resistance she would meet. But that wasn't how she played the game. Wade had spent years perfecting his ability to navigate legal loopholes and manipulate people into giving up before the fight even began. He was expecting her to exhaust herself, to rage against a bureaucratic wall until she either gave up or let him dictate the terms of her surrender. That wasn't going to happen. Instead, she focused on the angles he wasn't covering, the vulnerabilities in his carefully constructed facade. He had moved fast, too fast, securing the legal transfer of the driveway before anyone could challenge him. That meant he either had help on the inside or had managed to slip his request through a system that wasn't designed to scrutinize small-scale property adjustments. Either way, it gave her a lead. She spent the next few hours compiling every piece of evidence. She had the original deed stating the driveway was shared access, the public records showing the abrupt transfer, and the financial connections between Wade's LLC and the private equity firm. She drafted a detailed email and sent it to the best real estate attorney she could find on short notice, a woman named Rachel Vance, who had a reputation for dismantling fraudulent property claims. Rachel called back within 20 minutes. "You weren't kidding," she said, her tone sharp and alert. "This is blatant as hell." "So you think I have a case?" Alice asked. "Oh, you have more than a case. You have a smoking gun. The problem is, if he was able to push this through, it means he has people covering for him. We can challenge it, but it won't be quick." Alice had already expected that. "What's the fastest way to stop him before this gets worse?" Rachel hesitated for only a moment before responding. "You file an emergency injunction to freeze any further modifications. That'll put everything on hold legally until we can argue it in court. If he's already trying to implement changes, it'll force him to stop." Alice nodded, already mentally moving to the next step. "How long does that take?" "If we're lucky, a few days. If we're not, longer. But I'll start the paperwork now." "Do it," Alice said, "and send me anything I need to sign." Rachel agreed and hung up. Alice exhaled, feeling the first real sense of control since this started. But she wasn't done yet. She went outside and walked the length of the newly fenced-off driveway, studying every detail of the construction. The gates weren't just a standard installation. Whoever had put them in had done so with professional efficiency. The welds were precise, the electronic lock system was integrated seamlessly, and the entire thing had been secured into deep concrete footings, which meant this had been planned weeks in advance. That thought sent a fresh wave of anger through her. Wade hadn't just decided to do this recently. He had been waiting, preparing, ensuring that by the time anyone noticed, it would be too late to reverse easily. Alice wasn't the only one watching the gates. As she walked toward the far end of the fence, she spotted an older couple from down the street standing near their mailbox, whispering to each other. When they saw her looking, they hesitated before the man, Martin Decker, finally waved her over. "You're Alice, right?" he asked as she approached. She nodded. "Yeah. And I'm guessing you already know what I'm about to ask." Martin sighed, glancing toward the gate. "This is some serious bullshit, excuse my language. Wade's been talking about security improvements for months, but no one thought he'd actually go through with it." Alice frowned. "He told you about this before he did it." "Not exactly," Martin admitted. "He just made it sound like some minor adjustments to streamline access or whatever fancy term he used. Nobody paid much attention because he's always finding ways to make life difficult, but we didn't expect him to physically cut us off from our own damn driveways." Alice's stomach tightened, so he primed everyone to ignore it until it was too late. Martin nodded. "Seems that way. And now that it's up, some of the neighbors are scared to push back because they think he actually owns the damn thing." Alice felt the anger return, sharper this time. "That's exactly what he wants." Martin hesitated, glancing at his wife before lowering his voice. "Listen, I don't know if this helps, but when they were installing the gate, I saw something weird." Alice's pulse quickened. "What?" "It was late, maybe around 2 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, so I was sitting on the porch, and I saw a black SUV parked down the street. Didn't recognize it, and it wasn't one of the workers' trucks. 2 guys in suits got out, talked to Wade for a few minutes, then left. Didn't look like your usual contractors. That sent a chill down Alice's spine. You get a look at them." "Not really," Martin admitted. "But they weren't from around here, that's for damn sure." Alice clenched her jaw. That confirmed that Wade wasn't just working alone. There were other players involved, and if they were meeting in the middle of the night, it meant whatever was happening was bigger than just a property dispute. She thanked Martin, made a mental note to check security footage from her cameras, and went back inside. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but she still didn't have the full picture. She needed to find out who those men were, why Wade was involved with them, and what the real goal behind this entire operation was. That night, she barely slept. The next morning, her doorbell rang earlier than expected. Alice opened it to find a manila envelope sitting on her porch. There was no name, no return address, just her own name, typed neatly across the front. She picked it up, heart pounding, and took it inside before carefully opening it. Inside were several printed documents, and as she scanned them, her blood ran cold. The first page was a purchase agreement for multiple properties in her neighborhood, marked as pending acquisition by the same private equity firm Wade had connections to. The second page was an internal email exchange, detailing long-term redevelopment plans that mentioned Wade by name. And the third page was worse. It was a list of names, including hers. The title at the top read Targeted Property Displacements Phase 1. Alice inhaled sharply. This wasn't just about Wade's greed. This wasn't just about a driveway. This was a coordinated effort to push people out of their homes, and she was next. Alice sat at her kitchen table, the manila envelope spread open in front of her, the papers neatly arranged yet burning into her vision like a flashing warning sign. The weight of what she had just uncovered settled into her chest like a slow, suffocating pressure. This was no longer a battle over a driveway, no longer about an arrogant neighbor testing how much control he could exert over a shared space. This was calculated, systematic, and far-reaching. The purchase agreements, the planned acquisitions, the corporate interest in the neighborhood, none of it was coincidental. Wade was just one piece of a much larger effort, and now she had confirmation that she was not only an obstacle to their plans but a target. Her mind raced through the implications. The sudden and aggressive move to seize control of the driveway made sense now. It was the first domino in a larger strategy: limit access, create frustration, and push homeowners towards selling by making daily life as inconvenient as possible. Once enough properties had been forced into a sale, the buyers would swoop in, likely under the guise of redevelopment or some community improvement project. And then, the neighborhood would be transformed, rezoned, turned into whatever maximized their investment, leaving those who had lived there for years with nowhere to go. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to focus. This wasn't just about understanding what was happening, it was about finding a way to fight back. But how? Wade had played his hand early, revealing himself as the face of this operation, but he wasn't the one pulling the strings. The men in suits Martin had seen, the private equity firm linked to Wade's LLC, the anonymous phone call warning her to stop, they were the real threat, and she needed to figure out who they were, how deep their influence ran, and what leverage she could use against them. Her first instinct was to contact Rachel, but before she could dial, her phone vibrated with an incoming call. Unknown number. She stared at the screen, pulse quickening. Another warning? Another attempt to rattle her? She answered, keeping her voice steady. Alice speaking. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a different voice from last time, male, calm, polished. MS. Grayson, I assume by now you understand the situation you're in. She didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to speak first. You have information you weren't meant to see, the voice continued. That was unfortunate. However, this can still be resolved cleanly. You don't need to involve yourself in something that doesn't concern you. Alice's grip on the phone tightened. You're calling me to tell me to back off. That usually means I'm closer to the truth than you'd like. A quiet chuckle. You misunderstand. This isn't a warning. It's an opportunity. You're a smart woman. You know how these things work. Some battles aren't worth fighting. So you want me to just roll over and accept that you're running people out of their homes? I want you to make a rational decision. Walk away, and you won't have to be a part of this. Your property will be protected. No complications. But if you insist on forcing a confrontation, a slight pause. You may not like where it leads. Alice's jaw tightened. I'm not easily intimidated. That's what makes this unfortunate. The line went dead. She lowered the phone slowly, staring at it for a moment before setting it down. The message had been clear: Wade's handlers weren't going to sit back and let her interfere. They weren't threatening outright violence, at least not yet, but they were making it known that she was up against forces that had the power to make life very difficult for her. She needed more information. Real, actionable intelligence that she could use not just to fight back legally, but to expose what was happening. She wasn't just trying to stop them from controlling the driveway anymore, she was trying to dismantle whatever operation they were running before it reached its full scale. She pulled up her laptop and did what she did best: investigated. Starting with the private equity firm listed in the transaction records, she scoured financial filings, corporate structures, and subsidiary companies, looking for patterns, connections, anything that stood out. What she found was a tangled web of shell corporations and offshore accounts, but buried in the layers of redirection was a familiar name: Norwood Development Group. Alice leaned back, exhaling sharply. She knew that name. They had a reputation in real estate circles for buying out troubled neighborhoods, reclassifying zoning regulations, and pushing aggressive redevelopment projects that always seemed to disproportionately displace long-term residents. There had been lawsuits, protests, but nothing had ever stuck: too much money, too many well-placed allies. And now they were here, operating through smaller firms, using people like Wade as frontmen to keep their hands clean. She needed more. She needed proof that Wade wasn't just acting on his own, but was directly involved in their displacement strategy. And to do that, she needed access to records he wouldn't want her to see. Breaking into his house wasn't an option, but breaking into his digital records? That was something else entirely. She knew Wade wasn't particularly tech-savvy. He relied on control through legal loopholes and bureaucratic maneuvering, not encryption and digital security. And if he was anything like most overconfident middle-aged men who thought their understanding of power made them untouchable, he probably wasn't careful with his information. She ran a network scan from her laptop, searching for active devices on the local grid. Wade's home network showed up immediately, broadcasting under the default manufacturer name of his router: Amateur Mistake. A secondary network caught her attention, labeled Wade_private, and she smirked. He might as well have called it My Sensitive Documents. She didn't hack him outright; that would have been illegal. But she didn't need to. Instead, she triggered a deauthentication attack, forcing his devices to temporarily disconnect. When he inevitably re-entered his Wi-Fi password, her system captured the encrypted handshake. It wasn't a sophisticated network, and within minutes she had access. Scrolling through the connected devices, she found what she was looking for: his work laptop, a generic model likely used for handling all his property dealings. She mirrored his browsing history and scanned for recent file activity. What she found made her stomach tighten. There were emails between Wade and Norwood executives discussing targeted pressure strategies for homeowners who had been deemed obstacles. There were references to preliminary zoning requests that had already been filed, suggesting the neighborhood's redevelopment was further along than anyone realized. And there was a list of property values, estimating how much each house would be worth once they had been reclassified. Her house was on that list. So was Martin's. So was every other person Wade had tried to isolate. Alice's pulse pounded as she copied everything. This wasn't just about a legal dispute anymore. This was organized, large-scale fraud and coercion. And she now had the proof. As she was transferring the last file, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. "MS Grayson, you should stop." She stared at it, heart hammering. Then another message appeared. "We see you." Her breath caught as she glanced toward her window. Across the street, a black SUV sat parked in the shadows, headlights off, engine running. They knew, and they were watching. Alice's hands hovered over her keyboard, her breathing slow and controlled despite the pounding in her chest. The text messages on her phone stared back at her, their meaning as clear as the black SUV idling across the street. "We see you." A simple phrase, but layered with implication. It wasn't just a warning. It was a confirmation that her actions hadn't gone unnoticed, that Wade's backers were aware of how deep she had gone into their operation, and that she was now a moving piece on their board. But Alice wasn't the type to be easily rattled. Fear was a tool, a weapon used to control outcomes before they even occurred, and she had spent her career dismantling threats that operated on intimidation. If they were watching, it meant they were waiting for her reaction, hoping she'd panic, make a mistake, reveal her next move. She wasn't going to give them that. Instead, she turned off her phone's screen, pulled the files onto an encrypted drive, and disconnected from Wade's network. She had what she needed: the emails, the financial records, the evidence that Norwood Development Group was actively manipulating property values and zoning regulations through fraudulent means. This wasn't just about forcing homeowners out, it was about rigging the system in their favor before anyone had a chance to stop them. She had options now. She could take this straight to Rachel, let the legal team handle it, push for an immediate injunction with hard evidence that Wade had conspired with Norwood executives. But something in her gut told her it wasn't that simple. Wade wasn't the real problem, he was a pawn, a disposable figure designed to shield the real players from direct exposure. If they were already sending warnings, it meant they weren't afraid of legal battles. They were prepared. Which meant Alice needed to be one step ahead. She shut her laptop and moved to the window, keeping to the shadows as she studied the SUV. No movement. Whoever was inside was in no rush to leave. They were just watching. She knew better than to confront them directly, that would be playing into their hands. Instead, she made a calculated choice. She grabbed her car keys, casually threw on a jacket, and stepped outside as if she were about to leave for an errand. The moment she locked her front door, the SUV's headlights flickered on, its engine humming to life. Good, she had their attention. She climbed into her car, keeping her movements deliberate but unhurried, and pulled out of the driveway. The SUV followed. Not aggressively, not recklessly, just close enough that there was no doubt about its intent. They wanted her to know they were tailing her. Alice didn't change her pace. She drove as if she hadn't noticed, as if she wasn't deliberately leading them away from her house. She took a familiar route through the neighborhood, then veered onto a main road, merging with heavier traffic. The SUV stayed with her, maintaining a steady distance, never overtaking, never lagging too far behind. They weren't trying to hide. She made a few unnecessary turns, testing them, confirming what she already knew. Then, without warning, she pulled into the parking lot of a police precinct. The SUV hesitated at the entrance. That single moment of uncertainty told Alice everything. They weren't prepared for her to make this move, which meant they weren't affiliated with law enforcement, not directly anyway. After a brief pause, they continued past the lot, not stopping, not slowing, just disappearing into the stream of traffic. Alice exhaled slowly. They weren't ready to escalate yet. They wanted control, not chaos. That was a weakness. She parked in a visitor spot but didn't get out. She had no intention of filing a report, not yet. This was about establishing a psychological boundary, sending her own message. She wasn't going to play the victim. She wasn't going to be an easy target. If they wanted a fight, they weren't going to get a desperate homeowner scrambling for help. They were going to get someone who knew how to strategize. She waited 10 minutes, long enough to make it clear she wasn't running. Then she left, taking an alternate route home, ensuring she wasn't followed. By the time she stepped back into her house, she had already made her decision. It was time to push back. She opened her laptop again, this time with a different plan in mind. She wasn't just going to react to Wade and his handlers, she was going to make them react to her. First, she compiled a secure copy of the files she had pulled from Wade's network, encrypting them and uploading them to a cloud drive. Then she drafted an email concise, precise, and loaded with implication and sent it to a handful of recipients. Rachel Vance, her attorney, with a subject line that simply read, "Let's talk strategy." A journalist she trusted, a name she had worked with before on a separate cybersecurity case, attaching a single redacted document as bait. An anonymous tip to a state regulatory agency, linking Norwood's ongoing zoning applications to the fraudulent property acquisitions. She wasn't setting off an explosion. She was lighting fuses. By the next morning, the first reaction came not from Wade, but from Rachel. She called as Alice was making coffee, her voice sharper than usual. "What the hell did you just send me?" Alice took a slow sip before answering. Evidence. This isn't just property fraud. This is federal-level shit, Alice. You're talking about coordinated displacement, financial manipulation, possible racketeering, and you sent this to a reporter. I sent a piece of it, Alice clarified. Enough to make them start asking questions, not enough to compromise our position. Rachel exhaled, clearly restraining the urge to curse. And you're assuming that's not going to get a reaction. Alice's eyes flickered toward the window, half expecting to see another SUV. I'm counting on it. Rachel was silent for a moment. Then, quieter, they're not going to just let this go. I know, Alice admitted, but neither am I. The next escalation came later that afternoon. She had just finished going through more financial documents when she heard a loud, deliberate knock at her door. 3 sharp raps, not the polite kind, the authoritative kind. She checked the peephole. 2 men in suits, not cops, not neighbors. She didn't open the door. Instead, she grabbed her phone and started recording before speaking through the locked door. Can I help you? One of them, tall, bald, professional-looking, smiled like they were old friends. MS Grayson, we just have a few questions. Shouldn't take long. Alice didn't move. Questions about what? The second man, shorter, stockier, less polished, tilted his head. We hear you've been looking into things that don't concern you. Alice felt the adrenaline spike, but kept her voice even. And who exactly is we? The taller one chuckled. Let's just say we represent interested parties, people who prefer discretion, people who believe it's best when everyone knows their place. Alice didn't blink. Then you should know mine. And it's not outside my own damn house talking to strangers who won't introduce themselves. The second man exhaled sharply, clearly losing patience. Just be careful, MS Grayson. Curiosity can be dangerous. They turned and walked away. Alice locked the door, her fingers tightening around her phone. It was official now. They weren't just watching anymore. Alice stood in the dim glow of her living room, gripping her phone as the 2 men disappeared down the street, their suits blending into the shadows of the evening. They hadn't threatened her outright, but their presence alone had been enough. This wasn't a subtle game anymore. They were done with indirect warnings. They had shown up at her door, on her property, because they wanted her to know she was officially a problem. And that meant she was running out of time. She had known pushing back would provoke a response, but now that it had happened, she needed to move before they did. The way they carried themselves, the calculated confidence, the barely concealed irritation told her something important. They weren't used to being challenged. That meant they weren't prepared for her next move. She sat down at her desk, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she finalized the files she had been gathering. She had already sent pieces of evidence to Rachel, the journalist, and the state regulators, but now it was time to escalate. She compiled every document, emails, financial transactions, zoning applications, property transfer records, and most damning of all, the internal strategy files that outlined how Norwood planned to forcibly displace homeowners under the guise of legal property acquisitions. She compressed the data, encrypted it, and uploaded it to multiple secure locations. Then she wrote a single, direct email with a link to the files. Recipients Rachel Vance, the journalist. A federal investigator specializing in corporate fraud. A state senator known for opposing corrupt real estate practices. Subject urgent coordinated property fraud and coercion. Body. This isn't just about a driveway, it's bigger. And it's happening now. She hit send. Almost instantly, the weight on her chest lifted, not because she was safe, but because she had taken control. If they wanted to silence her, they were too late. The information was out there, beyond their reach, impossible to erase. Her phone buzzed. Rachel, Alice answered. You just started a war, Rachel said, her voice a mix of disbelief and reluctant admiration. I know. Rachel exhaled sharply. You sure about this? Alice glanced toward the window, where the street was still and quiet, the SUV long gone. Absolutely. There was a pause. All right, Rachel said finally. Then let's finish it. The next 48 hours unfolded like a slow-burning explosion. The journalist wasted no time publishing an investigative report, linking Norwood Development Group to illegal property seizures and fraudulent rezoning efforts. The senator publicly called for an immediate state-level investigation. And Rachel? She filed a motion for an emergency injunction, halting all ongoing acquisitions in the neighborhood, forcing Wade and his handlers into an immediate legal battle they hadn't been prepared for. The morning after the article went live, Alice woke to the sound of tires crunching over gravel. She barely had time to react before her doorbell rang, the chime slicing through the tense silence of her home. She knew who it was before she even checked. Wade stood on her porch, his usual smug composure replaced with something closer to quiet fury. His suit was crisp, but his posture betrayed tension, his jaw tight as he stared at her through the peephole. She opened the door but didn't step back to let him in. "You've made a mistake," he said without preamble. Alice leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. "That's funny. I was about to say the same to you." His lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't understand what you've done." "I understand perfectly," she countered. "I understand that you thought you could play God with this neighborhood, that you could manipulate the system just enough to stay untouchable. And I understand that you seriously underestimated how much I was willing to fight back." Wade exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like she was some naive fool who had just thrown herself into a battle she couldn't win. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Alice narrowed her eyes. "Then let's talk about endings. The article is out. The state is involved. You're under investigation for fraud, coercion, and property manipulation. Your backers? They're cutting ties with you as we speak. I doubt they'll be making any more house calls." Wade's expression didn't change, but she caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You should have walked away," he said quietly. Alice tilted her head. "You first." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Wade took a step back, straightening his jacket like that tiny act of control could somehow restore the power he had just lost. Without another word, he turned and walked to his car. Alice watched as he pulled out of her driveway and disappeared down the street. It wasn't over. Not yet. But Wade's retreat told her everything she needed to know. He knew he had lost. 2 weeks later, the legal system caught up with him. The state investigation into Norwood uncovered a pattern of fraudulent acquisitions, with Wade directly implicated in coercive property seizures. He was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, and though his lawyers fought to stall the case, the weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore. Norwood Development Group severed all ties with him, disavowing any involvement, leaving him to face the fallout alone. His assets were frozen, his reputation destroyed, and his once unshakable confidence gone. The neighborhood, once caught in a web of quiet fear, began to rebuild. The gates that had once symbolized control were torn down, and the residents who had once doubted whether they could fight back now knew that they could win. Alice didn't celebrate, not yet. She knew how these things worked. There would be appeals, legal maneuvers, desperate attempts to claw back what had been lost. But the difference now? She wasn't alone. She stood at her window one evening, watching as life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the street in golden shadow, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace. Then her phone buzzed. A new message. No number attached. "You made an enemy today." Alice stared at the screen, then exhaled slowly, locking her phone and setting it aside. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Alice stared at the message on her phone, the weight of those 5 words settling into her chest like a cold, heavy stone. "You made an enemy today, no name, no number, just a statement of fact." A final, desperate attempt to remind her that even though Wade was finished, the people who had backed him weren't gone. The machine behind him hadn't stopped turning, and somewhere, someone was still watching, still waiting, still calculating their next move. She didn't delete the message. She didn't reply. She just locked her phone and set it face down on the table, staring out the window as the quiet hum of the neighborhood settled around her. It was a strange thing, the feeling of winning a battle that still didn't feel entirely over. Wade was done, his fraudulent claims on the driveway officially overturned, his assets frozen, his name making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Norwood Development Group had gone into full damage control mode, publicly severing ties with him, shifting blame, pretending they had no idea what had been happening. But Alice knew better. They weren't innocent, they were just careful. They had been testing the waters, seeing how far they could push before someone pushed back. And now that someone had, they had done what corporations always did when caught in the act: they retreated. For now. The gates were gone by the end of the week. The same workers who had installed them returned in the early hours of the morning, tearing them down as if erasing the evidence would erase everything that had happened. Alice watched from her porch as the metal was dismantled piece by piece, the keypad ripped from its post, the towering iron barriers loaded onto a flatbed truck. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just the quiet undoing of Wade's last attempt at control. And then it was over. The neighborhood was free again, or at least, it should have been. But Alice had spent too much time untangling the layers of deception behind this scheme to believe it was truly over. Wade might have been the face of the operation, but he had never been the architect. He had been a tool, a pawn used to test how much resistance they would meet. His downfall wasn't the end of the game. It was just the removal of a piece they had been willing to sacrifice. The real players were still out there. And Alice knew they hadn't forgotten about her. The first week after Wade's public disgrace, things were eerily normal. The tension in the neighborhood began to dissipate. The residents no longer looking over their shoulders, no longer whispering about legal threats and forced buyouts. Martin Decker, the old man who had tipped Alice off about the black SUV, had come by her house with a bottle of whiskey and a simple, gruff thank you. Others followed, their gratitude quieter but no less genuine. People who had once been too afraid to fight back now understood the power of resistance, and that at least felt like a real victory. But Alice wasn't celebrating. She was waiting. It started small. A week after Wade's indictment, Alice's bank flagged an unauthorized attempt to access her accounts. Nothing was stolen, but it was enough to make her gut tighten. A few days later, she noticed a car idling a little too long near her house. The same black sedan parked half a block away, engine running but never moving until she acknowledged it. Then came the call from her insurance company, informing her that someone had submitted a claim under her name, attempting to alter the ownership records of her home. Each move was subtle, calculated. Not a direct attack, but a reminder. She was still on their radar. And that was fine. She wasn't leaving. She was building defenses. Alice spent the next week securing everything. Every financial account, every legal document, every trace of vulnerability she could find. She encrypted her systems, rerouted her digital footprint, made it as difficult as possible for anyone to move against her without being seen. She contacted Rachel and ensured that if anything happened to her, the remaining documents she had uncovered would be sent to the authorities, the press, and every legal entity involved in the case. If they thought they could erase her involvement, they were wrong. She was a problem that wouldn't disappear. And then, after 2 weeks of silence, the package arrived. No return address. No markings. Just a plain, nondescript box left on her porch. Alice stood over it for a long moment, every instinct in her body screaming that this was a test, a final move in a long, drawn-out game of control. She took a slow breath, steadied her nerves, and carefully carried it inside, setting it on the table with the caution of someone handling an unexploded device. She opened it. Inside, beneath a layer of tissue paper, was a single manila folder. She pulled it out, flipped it open, and felt her breath hitch. It wasn't about her. It was about Wade. Dozens of surveillance photos, capturing him over the past 2 weeks leaving his lawyer's office, meeting with an unknown man at a restaurant, sitting alone in his car, staring at nothing. His face was different in these images. Gone was the smug confidence, the carefully maintained composure. He looked paranoid, exhausted, hunted. Beneath the photos was a handwritten note. "No one likes loose ends." Alice's hands tightened around the folder. This wasn't for her. It was a warning to Wade. He had been useful to them once. Now he was a liability. And that meant, for the first time, he was afraid. Alice exhaled slowly. closing the folder and setting it aside. She knew what this was. They weren't going after her. Not yet. They were tying up loose ends. They were cleaning house. And Wade? He was alone now. For a brief moment, she considered what she would do next. She could ignore it. She had won her fight, she had exposed their game, and she had secured herself against whatever came next. Wade wasn't her responsibility. He had made his choices, and now he was paying for them, but Alice wasn't built that way. She picked up her phone, hesitated, then dialed a number she never thought she'd call. The line rang twice before Wade picked up. His voice was different now, quieter, raw. "What do you want?" Alice glanced at the photos again, her grip tightening. "I think," she said carefully, "you're about to find out what it feels like to be on the other side of this." There was silence. Then, barely above a whisper, "They're coming for me." She didn't disagree. But the real question was, what was she going to do about it?